Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jill Saporin, and I'm a board member at BigTent. I'm delighted to host this evening's discussion with Richard Haass and Katie Couric. At BigTentUSA, we put democracy over partisanship. We're a nationwide women-led voter coalition dedicated to protecting the rights of women, the rights and futures of our children and grandchildren, and of course, democracy. We carry out our mission through educational events like this one and providing ways for you to become more civically engaged. So speaking of right now, you can join us in several letter writing campaigns we have to help get out the vote. And you can use our brand new issues-based talking points tool in your conversations. It was just released today and developed in collaboration with the League of Women Voters Gold Coast. And check out the many other activities we offer for you to help save our democracy. We've got links in the chat right now for all of this and more details. And for exciting new events of ours coming up, please visit our website to RSVP. And to learn more about us, follow at BigTentUSA on social media. And you can subscribe to our newsletter. We promise no spam. Now for a few housekeeping items. We welcome your questions and we'll be using the chat function exclusively for those. The Q&A feature has been disabled. So please put any questions for our guests in the chat and we'll try our very best to address as many as we can. To manage distractions if the chat bothers you, you can manually turn it off. And if you'd like, you can turn on closed captioning. They're both right there on your screen. The closed captioning is at the bottom and chat is Xing it out of the chat box. And finally, look for a recap of this event in your email inbox. It will include tonight's recording and all the links. So now I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. Dr. Richard Haass served as president of the Council on Foreign Relations for 2 decades. Before becoming president emeritus, he chaired the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland in 2013, leading to the pivotal Stormont-Haass Agreement the following year, which earned him the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. Haass held key roles in the U.S. Department of State, including Director of Policy Planning and Principal Advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. And he served as U.S. Coordinator for Policy on Afghanistan and envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. He is the author or editor of 14 books on foreign policy and U.S. democracy, including his latest bestseller, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. And please subscribe to Richard's newsletter called Home and Away. Katie Couric is an award-winning journalist and #1 New York Times bestselling author. Couric was the first woman to solo anchor a network evening newscast, serving as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News from 2006 to 2011. This followed 15 years as co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. In 2017, she founded Katie Couric Media, which has developed a number of media projects, including a daily newsletter called Wake Up Call, a podcast called Next Question, a digital video series, and several documentaries. You can find that all at katiecouric.com. So we thank you both for being with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you, Katie and Richard.
Great. Jill, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. It's so thrilling to see people from all across the country. And a huge thank you to everyone at BigTent for providing a platform for these important conversations. I've known Richard for a long time. I turn to him when big global events happen. He gives me enormous perspective and insight. So I'm thrilled to be engaged in conversation because he's also one of my favorite people. So Richard, we're going to talk about what's happening globally because obviously that's your area of expertise. But in today's world, what's happening domestically is having such a big impact on how the US is viewed throughout the world. Last Saturday, an assassination attempt was made against former President Trump. And I want to read something you wrote in your wonderful newsletter called Home and Away. By the way, how can everyone subscribe to that? How do they do that, Richard?
They go to substack.com and they type in either Richard Haass or Home and Away, and there's a subscribe button. And the really good news, Katie, is everyone on this call can afford it because it's free.
There you go. Love it, as is ours. So sign up for Wake Up Call while you're at it. I'm going to read something you wrote in Home and Away. Quote, reactions from global leaders to the shooting came in quickly. Most, Russia was the most obvious outlier, wished the former president well and talked about the importance of the rule of law in a democracy. My hunch, though, is that privately, many leaders of our friends and allies were concerned about what this says about the United States, namely that it is deeply divided, awash in guns, and prone to violence, and that these traits could undermine its ability to be an effective partner for them in the world. My other hunch is that events here at home will reinforce their thinking that they had better prepare themselves for a second Trump presidency. Can you break down your thinking about the larger ramifications of Saturday's events for us right now?
Sure. And again, thanks for doing this. Always great to be working with you. Look, the first thing is that we have to understand that what happens here, as was said during the Vietnam protest, the whole world is watching. And that can be for better or for worse. When they see America do really well, I think it's the best advertisement for us and for democracy. And when we have problems, to say the least, it's anything but. It's also a reminder that so many of the countries around the world look to us not simply as an example, but they look to us for their security. They're dependent upon us. So even though they don't have a vote, say, in our election, even though they're obviously living somewhere else, they're dependent, they're vulnerable, they are affected by what happens here. So we here in America may not pay a lot of attention to the rest of the world, but the opposite is not true. The rest of the world sure pays a lot of attention to us because what we don't do affects them so much. And I think that comes to this election. The differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, if Joe Biden is the Democratic candidate, are large. And this changes something of a pattern, Katie, in American political history. If you look at elections since World War II, most of the time, the similarities between the candidates is much greater than the differences. And that isn't true this time. The differences in some cases are profound. And that brings me to your question. So if you're a country that's dependent on us, or even one that's not, there's no longer a presumption of continuity. Just because we had done certain things a certain way now or for a long time, it doesn't mean we're going to continue that. Some countries around the world may welcome that. I think, for example, some of our foes. But I think for many of our friends and allies, not for all, but for many, this is disconcerting. We may not be the America they knew, and we may not be there quite as unconditionally or automatically as they always thought. So what you're seeing around the world, foreign ministers, defense ministers, prime ministers, and the like, is a real rethink about where they stand vis-a-vis us. And if they can't depend on us, if our policies change, not in minor ways, but in big ways, how do they have to predict, how do they have to prepare for that? And how do they have to react to that?
I'm going to ask you about those potential policy changes. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, Richard, it seems this veering towards authoritarianism is more or less, or it's becoming a global phenomenon. We're seeing sort of the election of strong men, so to speak, in a number of countries. And I'm curious to hear what you think is behind this and the rise of populism in so many countries.
Well, actually, Katie, I think the second half is closer to it. I think the bigger trend around the world is people voting for change. If you look at, say, the French and British elections, what's so interesting to me is in both cases, you had a rejection of the status quo. In Britain, it took the country a bit to the center left, and France both to the far right and to the far left. In other recent elections in South Africa, for the first time since apartheid ended, you had the African National Congress no longer get a majority. In India, where you have something of a illiberal democracy, a democratic strongman in some ways, in the prime minister, he did not get the resounding victory that he had hoped for. So I think the biggest trend around the world is a vote for change. And that's bad for incumbents, but I think it reflects disaffection with the status quo. We've just had a rough time with COVID. Growth rates around the world have been low. Many societies are being buffeted by immigration. Globalization can bombard societies with information and images that some find disconcerting. So I think this is just a very tough time for governments, and particularly, again, those who are the incumbents, to succeed. And in some countries where they had been democratic, you're absolutely right. It's pushing them more to the right. And you see it most pronounced, as I mentioned, over recent years in India, in Turkey. We've seen it in Hungary, to some extent in Poland. We've seen certain elements of it here. I think democracies are being stressed all over the world.
Let me get back to what happened on Saturday, Richard, because in response to the assassination attempt, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "We do not at all think or believe that the attempt to eliminate presidential candidate Trump was organized by the current government, but the atmosphere that this administration created during the political struggle, the atmosphere around candidate Trump, provoked what America is faced with today." And Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said in a social media post that US lawmakers should use the money being spent to supply Ukraine with weapons, quote, "to finance the American police and other services, which should ensure law and order within the United States." What is your reaction to these statements? And is this an effort to cozy up to MAGA Republicans and Putin's Russia? Even more, I should add.
What I think it is it's almost an uncharacteristically naked expression of Russian preferences. I mean, everyone's heard the word bots and all that. Normally, the Russians do it through anonymous sources on social media. Where here we have government spokesmen essentially saying what they think. So I thought the comment that the Americans should stop spending money in Ukraine and instead spend the money here at home, that's essentially meant to fan American isolationism, to fan a major shift in American priorities. And obviously, the Russians want nothing more than the United States to abandon Ukraine, and that would let Mr. Putin pursue his dreams there. And the issue that matters most to Russia in foreign policy is Ukraine. The Russians have bet an awful lot on it. It's not going well for the most part after what, 2.5 years of war. In this phase of the war, they have very little to show for it. The territorial division is pretty much what it was, but Russia's lost hundreds of thousands of lives, enormous military equipment, and so forth. So, and of the candidates, it's clear that President Biden or most Democrats would support continued American military support for Ukraine. President Trump has raised big questions about it. His his running mate, the senator from Ohio, Mr. Vance, he talks about essentially ending American military support for Ukraine. So it's obvious what Russia would prefer to see.
Well, so you hear Russia's side of this bromance, but how do you explain what is driving what you call a bizarre romance with Russian authoritarianism by people in the United States? I don't get it.
It's a bit of a head scratcher. What is it? What is it that led people here who grow up in the world's oldest democracy to suddenly embrace authoritarianism? And this is now in the land of me trying to deduce from what I hear, what I see, and so forth. But I think there, again, people are unhappy with certain trends in American democracy. Some would say it's quote unquote wokeness, or they would say it's different proposals to deal with climate or other issues, gender issues. But there's been trends in our culture, in our society, in our politics that a lot of people in this country don't like. I think there's also a certain fascination with Christian nationalism that you see in Russia, and we see elements of it in the United States. So I think there's a certain resonance between certain groups and individuals in this country and what they see in Russia, and also in a place like Hungary. The fact that Viktor Orban just met with Donald Trump on the eve of the Republican National Convention, just before, actually, a few days before the assassination attempt, was no coincidence, in the sense that Viktor Orban is something of a model for what a lot of people would call an illiberal, a top-heavy democracy, where the balance of power in the country, or the pendulum, is shifting towards the government and away from the society.
Although intelligence officials have not found any tie between Saturday's failed attempt on Trump's life, what do you make of these reports, Richard, that US intelligence recently detected an Iranian plot against Donald Trump?
Yeah, that's interesting. Under the Trump administration, the United States assassinated the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces, Mr. Soleimani. And we've known for years that they've been going after senior officials who were associated with that, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and others. So the idea that they would also target President Trump, who was the person ultimately who had to make the decision, I don't find surprising. What was new, that there was this new intelligence tactically, that there was some kind of a plot afoot. It's a real reminder. The idea that what was it Saddam Hussein said? Revenge is a dish best served cold. That
I don't think he originated that, but go on.
Okay, we won't give him the quote unquote credit for it. Thank you for pointing that out. In any event, look, it's a reminder that we're in a low-level state of war with several societies, and this is one of the forms the war takes. It's in a gray area. It's not a battlefield war, but there's a lot of conflict all the same, and it's fought in again intelligence and paramilitary ways, and we've fought Iran in places like Syria and Iraq over recent years. We had the assassination of Soleimani. So look, this is just part of this world we're living in. We face major powers, the Russias, the Chinas, and others, but we also face these middle powers, and some of this is taking place in the open, like Ukraine, and some of it's taking place in the shadows.
You were a Republican when I met you at the Social Safeway many years ago. I think I was in my 20s and you weren't much older. Maybe you were in your 20s too, I'm not sure. But you've been a Republican, or were a Republican, for 40 years. You worked for George Herbert Walker Bush. You worked for George W. Did you work for George W. as well?
Worked for both President Bush, and also I worked for Ronald Reagan.
Right. And you have said, quote, "I don't need lectures about the Republican Party. The current GOP is not conservative. It's radical. It's populist. It wants dramatic change. It cares not for precedent. It's wrapped itself around the person of Donald Trump." I want to just hear your views on how your party has changed so dramatically, and how, quite frankly, so many Republicans just got in line. And you see, I'm wondering, like, where is Mitt Romney at the Republican National Convention? Where are some of these more moderate Republicans? And how do you think this happened? Is it all just because of the cult of personality and Donald Trump?
Okay, a lot of questions there. Look, when I joined the Republican Party, which was 40, 50 years ago, I joined it for several reasons. One, I thought it was much more serious about national security, about running a viable foreign policy. Secondly, economically, it was more market oriented. And socially, there was a kind of keeping government out of the bedroom, if you will. Every one of those things has been flipped. Republican Party now in many ways is isolationist. It's become a party of big government, big deficits, tariffs, kind of economic nationalism, if you will, and obviously intrusive in social life. So I ended up, and to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, I didn't leave the Republican Party. The Republican Party left me. This was no longer the precepts that brought me in were no longer there. And if you watch what's going on in Milwaukee, it's clearly not there now. This is a very different Republican Party. Why did it happen? It's a really interesting thing. I'm not sure to what extent Donald Trump was the engine, and to what extent he was more a vehicle that reflected certain social and cultural and political changes. I think it's a really big conversation about how did the Republican Party move, and it really changed its base in many ways. If you look at now, it's become much more of a white working class party. The educational levels of many Republicans are below those of many Democrats, and so forth. So the Republican Party has essentially changed its policies. It's changed its base, and however it got there, it's not something I'm comfortable with, and it's no longer a party of Mitt Romney. It's not a party of, to say it's not the party of Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush, even Barry Goldwater, people who we thought of as conservative, would be seen as dangerous liberals. It's
As
interesting.
rhinos.
Exactly. And that some of people like, George W. Bush is exactly the same age as Donald Trump. He's, I believe, 78. I could be wrong by a few months, but basically, he's not speaking. He's not invited. He's not speaking in Milwaukee. This is a very different Republican Party, and I think the fact that the vice presidential choice went to J.D. Vance tells you this is for at least for the foreseeable future. This is the DNA of this Republican Party. Just as an aside, I'll be very interested if the Democrats lose this November. It'll be very interesting to see where the Democratic Party goes and whether they have, if you will, a major moment, shall we say, of self-examination, potentially significant change. I expect there will be big battles among the different tendencies there. But for the time being, the Republican Party has gotten through its battles, and it is where it is. And as you said, people went in line. People who were quite critical of Donald Trump during the primaries, like Nikki Haley, got in line last night at the convention. And I think essentially it's like a poker game, if I could switch metaphors. That's the ante. If you want to play in this Republican Party, you want to play in the game, the ante is you have to be supportive of this platform, this presidential candidate. If you don't, you can still be nominally a Republican, but literally and figuratively, there's no place for you in Milwaukee. There'll be no place for you in a Trump administration if he wins this November.
I mean, it's just crazy that people like Nikki Haley and, I haven't pulled up her quotes, or JD Vance, who really criticized, didn't he call him, I forget exactly, an American Hitler or something. I mean, it's just amazing that they seem to have no moral compass in terms of having a position and then flipping to, basically pledge fealty to Donald Trump.
Look, I think whenever you're in a political situation like this, you've only got a couple of choices. And it's the same choice, by the way, people make all the time, whether they enter administrations or they leave them. And, people say to them, look, we're all ambitious. And so people have to say, okay, I'm ambitious. What price am I prepared to pay for that? Where am I prepared to compromise? If I want to have any influence, if I want to get invited into the room, I want to have a role in an administration, what do I have to sign up to? If I do that, can I still do some good? So some people rationalize it that way, that it's a necessary price they have to pay. There were a lot of people say, well, I'm not comfortable with a lot, but if I weren't here, things would be worse without me. Yeah, you've heard all the explanations.
Yeah.
Look, that's something between people and their conscience, and they've got to decide. It's not just a professional decision; it's a personal decision. What are you comfortable working with, to be affiliated with? Do you really think if you do go in, you'll have the ability to change it, to have influence? And you've got to weigh it. There's real personal and potentially professional costs. But I would simply say the people who are speaking in Milwaukee have clearly made the calculation that if it's not even about this administration, that for the foreseeable future, I'm talking about 2028, 2032, and so forth, that for this run of history, this is the dynamic of the Republican Party. And if they want to have a role in it, these are the parameters. They have to operate within these parameters. If they don't, their choice is to be in the wilderness, to potentially form a third party movement, to think about the Democrats, what have you. But if you want to be a Republican and work with them, this, I think, now is the price of admission.
I read that McMaster was even softening his position toward Donald Trump. So it goes. But let me turn our attention to President Biden, because you said that his debate performance was, quote, the shot heard around the world. How would you describe the impact that one event has had on the larger world's impressions of America? We covered the assassination attempt, but what about Joe Biden's leadership on display, and the fact that he was struggling so much during that debate?
It had an enormous impact. And the reason it had an enormous impact, Katie, and you know this from watching politicians your career, is that it reinforced rather than contradicted the take that was already held by many people on Joe Biden. If Barack Obama did badly in a debate, Ronald Reagan did badly in a debate, but they bounced back. And the reason they could bounce back is people had a pretty strong impression about them, and it didn't fit, so they were willing to reject it. But when Gerald Ford tripped or Dan Quayle made a mistake on something, it reinforced something that was already there. And I think that was the problem with Joe Biden on debate night, is people were already thinking he was too old. They already were uncomfortable with how he looked when he walked and so forth. But they hadn't been watching him that closely. And that night, 50 million people were watching, and it brought it into stark relief. So it reinforced what was already there, and it probably put it over the tipping point. And I'll be honest with you, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I don't think it's something he can come back from politically. I'll just put it out there. I don't think it's something that, and I said, look, I've argued now for a long time that he ought not to be the Democratic candidate. And just to be clear, I like him. I've known him for 50 years. I respect him. And I think he's been a pretty good president. So don't get me wrong. This is not an attack, but he's already got the burden of incumbency, given what we were talking about a few minutes ago. This is a rough year to run as an incumbent. So that's already one strike against him. He's associated with some very unpopular policies, things like the border, Gaza, and so forth.
But the Democrats and the Republicans tried to change that, and they were basically bullied into not voting for comprehensive immigration reform because it would give a win to President Biden, and our politics have just become so craven.
You're right, but it also took Joe Biden and his administration 3 years to get to that point. And they're paying a price for 3 years of not being particularly robust, if you will, about the border. But you're right, when they finally did change, and then the Republicans wouldn't work with them. And then there's the age issue, and the idea that, quite honestly, Joe Biden's going to turn 82 this November. If he were to be reelected, he would then turn 86 in the November of his final year as president. As he would say, come on, man. There's no way you could make the case that he would be.
And you believe he should step aside?
100%. I believe it in terms of service. I believe it in terms of politics. I think he should. And I wish he had stepped aside sooner. I think it would have created a real opening for the Democrats to have captured the public focus and excitement.
That's kind of in the category of coulda, woulda, shoulda, right, Richard? I mean, here we are. Do you think there is still, and then we're going to get back to some other international news and take audience questions, but do you think there's still a chance that he will drop out at this point in time? And do you think that means, as many Democrats have said, that Kamala is the obvious choice? Or do you think it will be open to a lot of other potential candidates like Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, Gavin Newsom, and J.B. Pritzker, right? What do you think is going to happen? I know it's hard to say, but.
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, but my own guess.
And and someone just mentioned in the chat, which I glanced at. Yes, you're right. Right before we logged on, the president has been diagnosed with COVID. He had to skip a speech, which sadly, I think only reinforces this strength versus weakness narrative that the Republicans are really focused on.
100%. So my own view is, and also Adam Schiff, who's running and most likely to win the Senate race in California, came out asking the president to step aside. A lot of people don't think he would do that without Nancy Pelosi's blessing. I think the polls in the swing states and the rest, all this is coming together, the COVID. I think the pressure will grow. So if you're asking me, and I might have given you a different answer a week ago, but as of today, and this, Trump's bounce after the assassination attack, the unity at the Republican convention in Milwaukee, I think all of this increases I think the odds now are better than even that Joe Biden will be persuaded to step aside. And that's the right word, persuaded. It's up to him. He's got the delegates. He has to be persuaded to let them go. But I think the odds now are better than even.
Maureen, who is watching, said you can get COVID at any age, which of course is true. On the other hand, it does reinforce a certain narrative as someone who is not 100%, physically or perhaps even mentally capable.
Look, I've had COVID 3 times, so I'm not in a position to, it's not about COVID per se, and it's not even fair. But who said politics was fair? I mean, it's just gonna, as you said, reinforce a certain pressure. If you're asking me, I think the pressures will grow. People are worried in the Democratic Party, not just about losing the White House, but they're worried about a clean sweep. They look at Washington and they go, we won't take back the House, we'll lose the Senate, the Supreme Court is already leaning the way it's leaning. You could have the Republicans run the table. And we can't let that happen. We, the Democrats, are saying. So my guess is the pressure will now grow. Self-preservation is a pretty powerful emotion in politics. So my guess is pressures will grow enormously. It's late in the day, I hear you. But I still think it's more likely than not to happen. I think the fact that it is so late in the day favors the vice president. I think Kamala Harris is then more likely than not to be the Democratic nominee if in fact the president steps aside. They'll have it'll be interesting to see whether anyone challenges her, what happens. I think the vice presidential choice for her then would be important. But yeah, if you're asking me, I think the odds are better than even. We're moving in that direction as late as it is in the political hour.
I know you're not a political strategist, but I'm just looking at some of the comments, and I get the same comments on my social media platforms where people are saying, stop squabbling. We have to get behind, I think Donna Morris said that, we have to get behind Biden. And I guess the question is, and again, it's sort of really more for a political strategist, but as all this infighting or disagreement is happening within the Democratic Party, is it further eroding support for Biden, and to the point where, he's going to have a even more difficult time in November?
Katie, it's a fair question, and that's one of the reasons he wasn't seriously challenged. The word went out over the last 2 years, don't challenge President Biden. History suggests when the incumbent president is challenged from within his own party, it weakens him. And we've seen that happen time and time again on both sides. So there was tremendous pressure on people who otherwise might have challenged him, including certain governors, not to do it. And they didn't do it. But we are now where we are. So it's not an ideal situation. So you've got to choose among the choices you got. You can't, it's too late to ask for a new hand. So
I think there are risks either way, right? There are
100%,
risks to staying
100%.
with Joe Biden. There are risks to changing
100%.
candidates this late in the game.
100%. And if you were to step aside, it's not a panacea. Suddenly, then you'd have the strengths and weaknesses of his substitute, whether it's Kamala Harris or someone else. She also would bear some of the burden of incumbency. And one of her challenges would be, where does she differentiate herself from Joe Biden? And as Hubert Humphrey showed in a different election, that can be a tricky path to walk. On the other hand, she brings some real strength. She's a lot younger. She's a very good prosecutor. I think she would be very good at prosecuting the case against Donald Trump.
Probably very good in a debate if another were to be held.
Right, and I think also her vice presidential choice could bring certain strengths to the ticket. So look. It's one of the things you often say about foreign policy. There's often no good choices. You just have to choose amongst the ones you have, and that's where I think the Democrats have. And as you correctly say, it's risky. It's risky what you do. But I will say in life that people often analyze the risks of acting, and they talk themselves out of it, and they don't subject not acting to the same level of rigorous scrutiny. So I think those who see all the problems with change also need to be just as intellectually honest when they look at the problems potentially of not changing at this point.
Yeah, I think some people are commenting that President Biden doesn't get credit for some of the things he achieved. And I feel like people are very protective towards him. And I think it's really not about whether or not you respect Joe Biden. It's about who can defeat Donald Trump.
I think, as I said, I think he's done some important things in his presidency, which deserve praise. I think the way he's managed the war with Ukraine has been by and large extremely impressive. The economy, I think, is doing well, despite issues about inflation and so forth. His commitment to democracy is palpable. So I think there's lots of good. He's had a distinguished career. And so, but again, that's not the question. That's looking backwards. I think the question now is looking forwards, whether it's 4 months or 4 years, is he the best person for those two challenges, for the 4 months of campaigning and for the 4 years of governing? And I would say at this point, no.
Let me ask you, and then I'm going to take audience questions, but since you have so much expertise and you and I have had many conversations on my social media about Israel, you have described President Biden's stance toward Israel as, quote, almost like a disappointed uncle, saying, gee, we really don't think this is the way to do it. How do you think President Biden should have handled our approach with Netanyahu differently from the very beginning?
Well, I think he was right on October 7th to totally associate himself with Israel's right to exercise self-defense. That was good. I think when he went there, it was good. I think it was a real good bonding moment. I think, though, every week and month that went by, and as it became clear, as you just quoted, that our advice was essentially being rejected, I don't think the president pivoted. He was still hoping that somehow he could persuade the Israeli government to do things differently. And after 9 months of persuasion, he doesn't have a lot to show for it. And anytime there's a gap between when the United States wants to see in the world and what we bring about, that's not a healthy situation. And that's what's happened here. So I think what he should have done much earlier was adopt a much more independent policy rather than trying to act through Israel to persuade the Netanyahu government to change. We just should have conducted our own independent foreign policy. We should have gone to the UN and introduced early on whatever resolutions we thought were necessary. We should have, we held up arms when we didn't want them used in Gaza, the heavy bombs. We could have done more of that or done it sooner. On settlements, when the Israelis went ahead with expanding settlements or creating new ones, I think we should have come down much harder against that. I think we should be articulating our own plans for the future of Gaza. I think we should be articulating our own plans for the Palestinians. I think we should be working directly with the Palestinian Authority to reform them and strengthen them so they do become a viable partner for Israel. So essentially, I think we need much more of a US policy towards the Middle East situation rather than a US trying to influence Israel policy, because that's not working.
I've talked to a number of my friends who are Jewish who seem to be gravitating toward Donald Trump because they believe he would be a stronger ally to Israel. And I'd love to hear from you if you think their feelings are justified.
It raises a really big debate. What Donald Trump would be, he'd be a less critical friend. Let me put it that way. He would basically give Israel more unconditional support if passed his prologue. But then you've got to ask yourself, and this gets into a really controversial, complicated space, so let me risk it here for a minute, which is what do the true friends of Israel do? If Israel is doing things that you believe are not good for the United States, but also not good for Israel, and I think that's the case in places like Gaza and places like the West Bank, is being pro-Israel mean to simply give them unconditional support? Well, we wouldn't say that about our own country. When we disagree with what we did, be it some of these same people in Iraq, or we disagree on our policy towards the border or policy on abortion, we weigh in, we get involved. I see nothing wrong with weighing in when we disagree with what Israel is doing. But I understand that, at a time that Israel has been isolated globally, that anti-Semitism is on the rise, a lot of people are going to gravitate towards a policy that seems to give Israel an unconditional embrace. But there's people like me who care deeply about Israel and its future, but who don't think the trajectory Israel is on is one that should receive an unconditional embrace. So that's where I would part ways. But I don't argue with your point. They'll be interesting. I think a lot of younger people will probably vote against Joe Biden because of what's happened in Gaza. My guess is as people
or get not vote at all.
Or good point. Probably though, people who are older. Jewish people would probably, I'd say in general, might though be more supportive of an alternative, because I think and by the way, Joe Biden is uncomfortable criticizing Israel. The reason he has done what he has done is he is of a generation that sees Israel, quite honestly, much more as David than Goliath. His emotional instincts are totally with Israel. And that's why he's so popular in Israel, by the way. He's been much more popular than Bibi Netanyahu in polls in Israel. People get it there. His instinct, his default option is to reach out to Israel as a friend and as a supporter. But I think subsequent generations in this country have a very different relationship with this. It's either more nuanced, or younger generations much more critical. And by the way, I worry about that. It's one of the reasons that I'm uncomfortable with simply greenlighting everything Israel wants to do, because I think ultimately it'll lead to a greater gap between America and Israel.
I just want to urge my team to add any questions to my document that we're getting live during the course of this conversation. And I'm going to go to those after this final question from me, which is, if in fact Donald Trump wins, and by the way, the polls, I was going to mention this 538 poll that didn't show a lot of movement, that they acknowledged it was done before Saturday's events. But if in fact Donald Trump is reelected, how do you see it changing the world order? And how do you see the realignment of our global situation? I mean, when you think about it, sort of almost like macrocosmically, what do you think?
I've been thinking a lot about it. I read the long interview that President Trump just had with Bloomberg. I've reread some of the writings of J.D. Vance. Look, my own sense is, they are not committed to much of the architecture that we've designed, built, and sustained over the last 75 years. That's just their take on things. I think they see it as the costs of it outweigh the benefits. I think you'd see several things in the macro of a Trump foreign policy. One is a real rethink of support for Ukraine, probably less support, maybe much more conditional support, and all that. So I think that's one thing. Second of all, President Trump, in his interview with Bloomberg, suggested much less support for Taiwan, raised all sorts of questions there. We just talked about the Middle East. I can imagine a more unconditional support of Israel. Potentially, I don't know, a tougher line towards Iran. We would see, because we're not sure what Iran's going to necessarily be. Because somewhere you have a new president, and you could in a few years have a new supreme leader. I think the biggest change, though, will be you'll have a foreign policy that won't be so close to allies. Trump is America first, Biden is allies first. I don't think the default position will be to associate or work with allies, but rather Donald Trump tends to have a foreign policy that thinks most about economics and sees allies in many cases as economic competitors. His approach to the world is more economic than geopolitical. And so he's not interested in promoting democracy, doesn't tend to give a pass to those who are democracies, is much more concerned, again, about trade balances, much more concerned about how much others are spending on defense, how much our commitments might cost us. So I think you'll end up with a much more restrictive, a much narrower American foreign policy. To simply call it isolationist is probably too black or white, but it would be more restrictive and much more focused on dealing with economic competition than geopolitical competition.
And what do you see in terms of a changing relationship with Russia? And of course, he has been very vocal about his opposition or criticism, I think probably I should say, of NATO.
So I think we'll stay in NATO under a Trump presidency. I can imagine there'd be fewer troops, American troops there, or more doubts about the reliability, or to use the word, automaticity of the American Article 5 commitment to come to the defense of others. I think even though Ukraine's not in NATO, it's the greatest threat to the stability and security of Western Europe. And as I said, I can imagine less support or whatever support there is being made much more conditional towards Ukraine. I also think you're not going to have a Eurocentric foreign policy. I think you'd have a foreign policy, so I'd say two things. One, that's more concerned potentially, as I mentioned, with economic issues, more concerned geographically with Asia, and also just the balance between domestic policy and foreign policy will swing towards the domestic. I think the general take is going to be there's neither the necessity nor the luxury of the United States being so active in the world. As Mr. McGovern once said years ago, "Come home, America." I think in a funny sort of way, we're going to see what used to be a theme of the left. I think it's going to be more and more a theme of the right.
And so what are the ramifications of that change in policy and attitudes about sort of the world order and our role on the global stage?
Well, my own view is that the United States has played an outsized role for 3/4 of a century, and without us, this world order doesn't do very well. It becomes less orderly, to say the least. I would think that war continues in Europe, and potentially Russia would gain the upper hand. China might be tempted to move against Taiwan if there's more doubts about America's willingness to come to bat for others. Either they will defer at times to powerful neighbors. Some of our friends may decide they need nuclear weapons of their own. They need to take matters more in their own hands. So I think you'll see a world with less American influence, less order, probably more conflict.
Does that make you nervous, Richard?
Oh, absolutely, because I think we've been enormously well served by this structure for 75 years. Hasn't been perfect, but as runs in history go, Katie, it doesn't get much better than this. And it's easy to critique the flaws of it or focus on the costs, but I don't think people have critiqued the flaws of the alternatives or focused enough on the benefits of it. So yeah, I worry that we could be in a phase of deconstruction, and I think we could do real historic damage.
Let me share some questions from our smart audience chatting away in the in the chat, and very opinionated with strong feelings, and I understand that. And by the way, everyone, this is ginger ale. It's not scotch, even though I could use a big stiff drink at this point. One person asked, how can we make the case to Trump voters and our nation that saving Ukraine is essential to American democracy?
Well, it might be a bit of a reach. I'm not sure it's essential to American democracy. What we do here at home will determine the future of American democracy, but it's very much in our security interest. We have a tremendous stake economically, politically, in the stability of Europe. We also have a tremendous stake that war not become a more frequent occurrence in the world. And if Russia is allowed to get away with invasion here, why would anyone think it will not be emulated elsewhere in the world by a North Korea or by a China or somebody else? So, yeah, and it's also been relatively inexpensive. If you add up everything we've done, we've put in less than the Europeans. It's not even maybe on the order of like 5% of our annual defense budget if you total it all up. So it seems to me it's been an enormous return on investment. Hasn't cost one American life. So I would actually argue it's a pretty cost-effective foreign policy. Could we survive if Russia were able to gain control of Ukraine? Yes, we could survive an American democracy, but I think it would light a fuse towards a far, far, far more violent, chaotic world. And it would be a world where we would have far less influence because people would say, wow, you weren't there for them. That means you may not be there for us. So I think this is a much more dangerous world we would be setting in motion.
I think people want to hear you talk a little more about J.D. Vance, who is 39 years old. Obviously, kind of Donald Trump is passing this baton in a way to him. He is 78 years old, and this is the future, if this is the future of the GOP. So can you talk about J.D. Vance's, you mentioned he's an isolationist, he's very much against supporting the war in Ukraine, but what signal is that sending to people around the world? And what have you heard in terms of reactions to his being tapped for vice president?
I'm not sure I'd call him an isolationist. I'd say he's much more, and when it comes to Ukraine, he's certainly against the policy. He doesn't think it's worth it. He might be more, it's not clear to me what his policy would be towards China and Taiwan. It's harder to read the tea leaves there. I think he shares a lot of Trump's views about the primacy of economics when it comes to foreign policy. He's something of an anti-interventionist. It's interesting. He served in Iraq, if I'm correct. He was in the Marines. And because of the 2003 Iraq War, really soured on what I've called wars of choice, and has become much more skeptical of American military interventions, which, by the way, is not an
Isn't
unhealthy.
that what an isolationist is, Richard? Kind of?
No, I think it goes beyond skepticism. I think an isolationism is someone who's not only skeptical or wary, but someone who, even when confronted with the facts, is still against it. So I think isolationism is more extreme. I'm not willing. He may end up there. At the moment, I would simply call. Again, he's politically moved a lot. Let's put it bluntly, in recent months and years. So
Yeah.
it's hard for me to pigeonhole him. But it's a word with a lot of baggage. So I would say my guess is he'll be more selective rather than across the board, where he favors non-interventionism. But his bias will be, yes, against interventions, more towards a domestic focus. At times, some of his language is intemperate. The way he reacted to the assassination attempt, essentially, to some extent, attributing it to the environment that the Biden administration and Democrats had. Look, he's combative. He is, vice presidents are often chosen to be combative. He will be combative both economically, because he's a bit of a popular, but politically. And that will be his role. I'm not sure he's necessarily Donald Trump's heir. Even if Donald Trump wins this election, we'll see how it goes. We'll see what J.D. Vance's role is. My guess is there'll be quite a few other Republicans who will still see it up for grabs. They won't see him as somehow the automatic successor. So I think it's too soon to anoint him as the 48th president, which some people seem to be doing.
And we're going to get to Project 2025. Everybody is chomping at the bit to talk about how that will impact the world order. I don't know how familiar you are with that nearly 1,000-page document, but before we get to that, someone said, why does Mr. Haass, you're Mr. Haass, Richard, very impressive, think Putin didn't invade Ukraine when Trump was president?
Well, the answer is, I think what took place were events in Ukraine that made him more worried about Ukraine's trajectory, about what it would mean. But what's so dangerous to Putin about Ukraine is that it's a Slavic country with ties to the West. It's liberal, it's democratic, and so forth. And that sets an example that Putin can't countenance, because what it would mean for Russia. And I think he saw.
I guess the question is, Richard, did you think it had anything to do with who was president of the United States at the time?
Could have been. It could have had to do with the Afghanistan, which, by the way, was a policy that Mr. Trump initiated and Joe Biden implemented.
Yeah, nobody really remembers that. I wish they had pointed that out during the debate, that this timeline was actually set during the Trump administration, correct?
Exactly. And if Donald Trump had won the election, it would have been implemented on his watch. And even if we hadn't had the messiness, where I think it was 13 soldiers lost their lives, put that aside for a second, as tragic as it was, it's quite possible Putin would have said, Ukraine is weak, Europeans are feckless, and these Americans, they just got out of Afghanistan, which Donald Trump would have done. He could have well invaded on Donald Trump's watch. So just because it happened then, my guess is it was Putin's assessment of the world situation. And by the way, also his assessment of his own army. Putin turned out to be wrong in assessing the American and the European and the Ukrainian reaction, as well as his assessment of the strength of the army, of his own army. But he might have made the same assessment on Donald Trump's watch.
So let's talk about Project 2025 and close things out with a conversation. How do you think this whole sort of game plan that has been conjured up by the Heritage Foundation and many other conservative groups, what impact do you see that having on American foreign policy and on domestic policy as well?
I take it pretty seriously for a couple of reasons. The main thing is that a lot of these ideas enjoy considerable currency in the Republican Party now, and a lot of the people affiliated with the project are going to get jobs. Every president gets to appoint 4,000 individuals to senior jobs across an administration. 4,000. That's cabinet, sub-cabinet, sub-cabinet, you name it. Well, some of those people will be people who wrote this report or clearly are sympathetic to it. Now, President Trump was politically smart probably to disown it. That way he doesn't have to defend every
But
paragraph
does
of it.
anybody really believe that?
Well, it makes it, again, it's a very good debating point. He doesn't have to defend it. He can say it's there, not my report. And then again, he can then offer jobs to a lot of those people, and they may very well introduce policies that are consistent with it. As I
And
think
Richard, sorry to interrupt, but it's not just those 4,000 people. I think this Project 2025 calls for removing
Right.
these career politicians who have expertise, who have been working in these agencies for years and are really actually not political appointees.
that's different, yeah, and that's a second wave, if you will, of personnel changes, where you not just have the 4,000 appointees, as I mentioned, but then yes, you're talking about a real attack on the independent civil service, on regulatory agencies, and so forth, where you could imagine litmus tests politically rather than expertise tests. So yeah, it's a real danger. Look, the whole idea of an independent civil service was one of the great early 20th century reforms for American democracy, about 100 years ago or so. Whole idea was to give us a qualified, permanent government. For its detractors, that's the deep state. For others, that's exactly what we need. We want the best and the brightest to go into government, and and we want to bring experts in, because we as citizens, you and I'll speak for myself. I'm not an expert on a lot of the issues that governments have to make policy about. So I want people who have worked their whole lives in these issues to be in a position to make responsible decisions. I want it to be transparent. I want it to be accountable, but I want them there. And what worries me is we're going to lose a lot of those people.
And I think in order to, that they are going to have to pledge fealty to Donald Trump. And as somebody said, who was kind of behind Project 2025, or one of the people, architects, said basically they're trying to institutionalize Trumpism.
Yeah, this is this election is big stakes. Sometimes, as I said before, similarities or there's a presumption of continuity. This is an election with enormous stakes. We talked mainly about the stakes for the world and for American foreign policy, major stakes here at home. I would urge everyone on this to get informed and to vote. This is a time to, those are obligations, as I've written about, for American citizens. This is not, democracy can't be about.
It's not a spectator sport.
Not a spectator sport. This is not a time to be a bystander. People have to get involved.
Richard, thank you so much for spending some time with all of us. I know everyone on this appreciates your willingness to share your views with us. It's great to see you virtually, and I hope I get to see you in person soon.
Thanks, Katie. It's, as ever, it's impossible to say no to you, but thank you all.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you both so much. You gave us some valuable insight as to what the world order could look like if Trump wins this election. And just to everyone out there, please go to our website. We have so much you can do to learn about Project 2025, to get the vote out, to register to vote. So please use all the resources on our website. And thank you all for spending your evening with us. See you next time, Big Tenters.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Katie and Richard. Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.